Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Hey, it's me, Bini. Stay close. There's monsters in these woods. Luckily, I packed this candle handle. Pretty good. But not as good as this pasta we're about to jump into. Creepypasta, that is. The term derives from the earlier term of copypasta, which was usually some body of text that was considered amusing or otherwise deemed worthy of reposting in an ironic way in any place that had a messaging system. This was stuff like the tale of Darth Plagueis the Wise, and you have to have a very high IQ to understand Rick and Morty, or the old but gold. What the f did you just say about me, you little bitch? Oh, and copypasta just comes from the idea that you copy and paste these from wherever you found them into a comment section or something. They were just being a little silly with it when they turned paste to pasta. And just so, Copypasta was turned into Creepypasta when internet horror stories began to gain major traction online and found themselves being reposted all over forums and later widely covered by YouTubers. Mostly in the form of voice narration, but... Is this the right place? Huh? Oh, very cool.
Stopped bust.
Oh.
Stopped bust, as in the sculpture from the shoulders up.
Oh, yeah. Alright, so here's the deal. Most stories have an antagonist, and as creepypastas gained notoriety for their horror stories, so did their antagonists. Looks like tonight we're gonna sculpt them as busts. There's all kind of classics in here, so let's just flip over to...
Go to page 92.
Slender Man! A good place to warm up. Originally part of a 2009 Photoshop competition on the Something Awful forum, as a submission posted by one Eric Knudsen, alias Victor Surge. His original post contains a black and white photograph of various children, with a photoshopped in Slenderman looming in the back, accompanied by the quote, we didn't want to kill them, but its persistent silence and outstretched arms horrified and comforted us at the same time. 1983. Photographer unknown. Presumed dead. He's a bit harder to see in these original entries, but people quickly latched onto the creature and it didn't take long for it to become an absolute phenomenon. The original thread for the competition started on June 8th, and on the 20th of the same month an indie horror series known as Marble Hornets dropped, following the escapades of a bunch of film students and their dealings with Slenderman, or as they called him, the Operator. Not only is that turnaround time insane, but Marble Hornets went on to contribute massively to the online horror space and influenced many that followed. His usual MO is stealing kids, or in the Marble Hornets depiction, he'll turn people into his proxies, which is just a fancy way of saying he's got them under mind control. That being said, the specifics of Slenderman are pretty nebulous, considering he started off as some pictures with some descriptions to lay the groundwork of his lore, but as other people started adding onto the mythos and contributing their own ideas, it's become more of a crowdsourced lore of different versions over the years. I'm sure a good chunk of you know Slenderman and what he looks like by now, and if I'm gonna start sculpting him, I'm gonna have to create a base. Our starting point, a sphere. Before we jump into anything too detailed yet, we just need to carve out the basic shape of a humanoid head and torso. That means extending out the bottom into a base and pulling out the top part, separating them out with the neck by carving away some mass in the middle. We're pulling the torso down into a wedge shape and pulling the head into a more bulbous shape, with a point at the front for our chin. We'll define the form by removing space under the jawline and adding in neck muscles, namely the sternocleidomastoid. That's the big long one. Here's a picture for reference. We'll also define the structure of the face by creating some depth under where the cheekbones would be. That way it looks more like a face without needing to give it actual features. I actually ended up sculpting a lot more torso definition than I really needed to, considering he's going to be covered with a suit. For said suit, we'll create a cube object and pull it over the shape of the torso, assigning a darker color for some visual distinction while we work. For the neck hole of the suit, we'll mask out a circle and pull it down so Slender can fit nice and snugly, and carve in an upside down triangle on the front so we can make a start on the actual aspects of the suit itself. I've gotta wonder who his tailor is, but for now that's us. I'm also drawing in the collar on its surface with some basic height lines and creating a new object colored red for the tie. This is just a stretched out sphere, and we'll pull it down into the bottom of that upside down triangle to fit snugly into its base, and draw a line at the upper end for the start of the knot that makes up the tie. It looks a little blobby at the back, but that's because it's sitting inside the suit where we can't see it, so there's no point creating details there. For Slender's lapel, we're drawing over the suit object with a mask in the shape of the lapels and pulling them outward so it looks more like it's layered over the suit. Since messing around in one object for the whole suit can get a bit wonky, we're just going to make a quick go around to crisp out those edges and make sure it looks more like an actual defined set of clothing. I'm also going to go over the shirt part of the torso with a white paintbrush, which doesn't actually do much in the long run, but I like seeing what I'm doing in a more complete way. That's pretty much the suit done, and now we can go back to the Slender head to make some tweaks and smooth out any rough brushes. Mostly, we're defining the skull even more, creating mass for the brow ridges, cheekbones, and creating slight dents where the eye sockets are. The suit gets the same treatment, and we'll go over it with a standard brush to draw in some simple wrinkling for a touch of realism. Plus, if this guy's wandering the woods all the time, there is no way he isn't getting some wrinkles in there. The head will just get a finish with a textured brush, that way the skin isn't too perfectly smooth and we can have some imperfection, however subtle. With our sculpt done, it's time for retopology. This means essentially recreating the model at a lower count of polygons. This will optimize our result and we can transfer the details of the higher polygon sculpt to its textures so we don't lose that detail. To do so, I'm using a cube that is being affected by a series of modifiers. These are basically effects for an object that serve all kinds of purposes, while also not affecting the polygons directly. That way we can still have some freedom while we're editing away. Of these modifiers, I'm using a subdivision modifier, which will simultaneously increase our polygon count a little while smoothing out the faces, giving a higher definition look. On top of that is a shrink wrap modifier, which can be placed in our cube and assigned to the sculpt so that it can conform to its shape and make our life just a little bit easier. Thankfully, since Slenderman's got no face, this is actually pretty peachy and we don't need any fancy tricks to get this done. It's just a matter of pulling faces to envelop the sculpt and adjusting as necessary to fit the shapes right, letting the shrink wrap do the bulk of the work here. The suit, though, is a little different. Since it's a much more complex shape with changes in elevation and harder angles, we're gonna need to retopologize the suit manually. This means creating edges along the trim of the suit and places like the lapel and collar, and it sure is time consuming, but the end result is well worth it. As for the tie, it's basically the same as the head, using a cube with the same subdivision and shrink wrap modifiers, but this time assigned to the tie. It's basically just a tube with a line in it, so nothing too crazy here. The suit's looking just a little too smooth, so I'm gonna go around the edges of the suit with some edge creasing, which are these pink lines you see here. These just diminish the smoothing effects of the subdivision modifier, allowing us to, crease the edges, making them harder and more visually distinct. Since I want to texture this guy, we need to make sure our model knows what parts of the model take up what parts of our texture space, and to do that we need to undertake UV mapping. Since this character isn't that complex, being a bust and all, we don't have to worry too much about the tedium of it. Our topology is clean, and that means we can mark these red lines, known as seams, pretty easily, contouring across the edges of our model and aiming to keep them as out of sight as possible. That means the seams on the head are lined up the side, and the seams for the suit go right up the front and back, lining up with the tie at the front so it's not as visible. You may be wondering why we need to try and keep these as hidden as possible, and while they're not visible in and of themselves outside of mesh editing like this, these are the lines where our model's faces will be split open and laid flat over our texture area. As a result, sometimes during texturing, these seams can become visible as it crosses the line from one UV island to another because of texture artifacts, which is basically fancy lingo for a visual glitch. As we take the plunge into texturing, we'll import our lower detail model and use a process called baking, in which we'll use a higher detail model as a reference point. And our software will bake the details into the lower detail model by creating a series of textures to affect the lighting and the way the model is rendered, creating the illusion that the model has the surface detail of the sculpted one. Now we can start, and first move on the docket is to give the skin on the head a somewhat organic tint. To do that, we'll use one of the textures we got from baking, which correlates to the thickness of our model. This emulates the real way blood and stuff gets shown in your face, and since the thinner your skin is, the more visible your vessels are and the redder it looks. I don't really want to make Slender blush right now though, so instead of a red tinge, I'm using more of an off-white. It's subtle, but it's there. Next up, we're drawing in some shading, namely around the neck area, but we're also using another baking texture known as ambient occlusion, which simulates the subtle shadowing in the more hidden parts of the model. The suit is probably the juicier part of this process, and while I didn't realize it at first, the colors that I painted in while I was sculpting actually came through as their own texture in the export, which I didn't expect, but it's a welcome surprise. I can layer it in as a visual direction and actually use it for masking as well by selecting the colors within it. Despite that, I'm still creating layered folders containing their own colors for each section. That way I just have more control over the shininess and whatnot. Since this stuff is fabric, I needed to have some weaving, and to do that I'm using some textures as masking for the fabric pattern, and using a combination of different shininess and a very slight height layer to give off the impression that this is a real piece of clothing, and not just a clay statue. And for the sake of variation, I'm using a slightly different types of fabric patterns for the suit, shirt, and tie respectively. Even still, it's looking a little too clean, and I'll be damned if this guy's walking through the woods unattended with a perfectly laundered suit. So, we're placing a dirt layer, which is actually just a bit of darkened color and some diminishing of the shininess. We could just draw it in, but since we have those baked textures from earlier, we actually have the option to use procedurally generated masks that use those textures as a guide. Thus, we have procedural dirt and wear, which we can adjust and pull back as necessary so it isn't too overbearing. After that, all that's left is to do some finishing touches to the texture and repair any artifacts that may have cropped up during our texturing process. I forgot to record myself doing it, but I also added Slender's black tentacles to the back using Bezier curves, which are essentially adjustable tubes of geometry that we can pivot to look like a set of tentacles. And with that, our first creepypasta antagonist comes to fruition. The Slender Man.
Acceptable result.
Alright, nice. 1 down, 2 to go. What do we have next?
842.
Alright, back into it, huh? But before we do, I want to make it known that the next few sculptures are only going to get more detail heavy as we go on, and since these are all upper body sculptures, I feel like I need to touch up on my anatomy knowledge, so I'd like to thank today's sponsor for this video, Skillshare. This place is a real hotspot for creatives like us. There's thousands of classes we can take in here. Let's just get some preferences on the board, and we've got all kinds of creative learning material to explore. Illustrations for you two-dimensional folk, classes on 3D modeling, animation, game design, I'll save that one. Oh, Skillshare also has learning paths where they keep collections of progressing classes for specific skills, which is pretty efficient if you're trying to get some curated value and aren't sure where to start. Skillshare is one of the largest online learning communities with thousands of classes, so you can bump up your skills to a higher level. Oh, here we go. I've been following this one. Michael Gatz's How to Sculpt Faces. It's for ZBrush, but anatomy knowledge is universal, so don't be afraid to get some knowledge in you. It goes over all the important stuff about facial proportions and skull anatomy, plus all kinds of techniques to help you make better sculpts. They even talk about creating a base mesh for future sculpts, something we'll be doing for the rest of our models. It's beginner friendly too, so if you're just dipping your toes, this ought to get you up to speed. This month, Skillshare is all about gratitude. They'll be sharing content on their own site about thankfulness in November and celebrating all the creatives out there and the progress they've made, as well as understanding that personal creative habits can be its own form of gratitude. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today! Now back to the video. Jeff the Killer, an angsty teenager turned murderer. The original story was written by user Sasur, whose name also happens to be Jeff. Do with that information what you will. As far as I know, the origin of the image actually hasn't been definitively found, but it's something people have been looking for a while now, and frankly it's incredible that it hasn't been found outside of a vague paper trail and a bunch of hoaxes. Especially considering the titanic success of this creepypasta, which is a bit ironic considering the fact that some considered it to kind of suck. Like, okay, Jeff starts out as this 13-year-old guy, right? He's pretty angsty and he ends up getting harassed by these bullies, but one day Jeff is forced to hang out at the weird neighbor kid's birthday party when said bullies jump the fence with guns. Which is already wild, but Jeff actually manages to kill one in the story, and he then proceeds to get bleach dumped onto his face and set on fire, which I don't think is great for you, but I also don't think it literally turns you into the Joker. I mean, he straight up carves a smile into his own face, not to mention the nose, or lack thereof. How did that happen? And if it was burning his skin, then why is he so smooth? Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but by the end of the story, Jeff is now Jeff the Killer, and his MO is to climb into people's windows at night and say his classic catchphrase, "Go to sleep." And then he kills them, so I don't know why he even asked. That being said, his widespread success on the internet can be attributed to the previously mentioned image, which came attached with the creepypasta and was the bane of many in the 2008 internet, where clicking the wrong link would get you a one-way ticket to a Jeff the Killer jump scare. Or Screamer, if you're an OG. Jeff's look is pretty distinct, with tones of white in his face and a hoodie to match, which isn't that visible in the picture, but it's mentioned in the story, so we've got confirmation there. His hair is a stringy black shoulder-length cut, and he's got that classic wide Glasgow smile, complemented by small piercing eyes that sit in dark circles and no iris to be seen. Luckily, this guy happens to be humanoid, so we can actually use the base we created for Slenderman as our baseline to sculpt on. To start off, we're just trying to get the forms of the head here. I'm adding a bit of mass to the cheek area because Jeff's honestly got a bit of a pear head, and holes for the eye sockets, plus spheres for the eyes and little painted pupils for reference. To get an idea of the mouth placement, we'll add some forms around the mouth, leading up into the nose bridge and then carving in a mouth over those forms. A real wide one. We could keep going from here, but I think it's better to have some visual direction. After all, that's why I keep painting onto the sculptures with no intention of using those colors later. So it's time to model. We're creating some teeth and gums here, and to do that, we'll start off with a cube and apply 2 modifiers to it. A mirror modifier to symmetrize it, and a subdivision modifier to give it some roundness. I'll extend out the shape to look like a C, and below that use some smaller subdivided cubes to act as the teeth. If these were all the same size and distribution, it'd look a little bit artificial, so to give it a little bit more of a natural smile, we'll make the tops of the teeth rounded and the bottoms flat for that shovel head shape that teeth generally have. And we'll make the 2 front teeth just a little bigger, and make sure the bottom row is smaller than the top row. With the teeth imported to our sculpt, we now have a good reference point to start sculpting around the mouth area, and we'll just define the jaw slightly and create a crease at the halfway point between the bottom of the mouth and the chin that'll create the definition for the bottom lip. With a better look at what we're working with here, we'll also adjust the positioning of the eyes and adjust the silhouette of the head to more closely resemble a person. Oh, well, a person with no nose anyway. Despite the fact the eyes are pretty much entirely circular, I still wanted a little bit of eyelid, so we'll just do some subtle ones without compromising the roundness of the eyes since it definitely contributes to the creepy factor. Like how insects have those big empty lidless eyes. Ugh. Some more moving around of shapes is in order, and we can draw in some lines under the eyes to act as the flowing angle change that separates the eye socket from the padding in the cheek and nose area. Some more finishing touches include defining the head shape to better match the original image, pulling up the shoulders to have more of a hunched look, and pulling the eyes forward a bit so they line up proportionately with the mouth. And now the head for Jeff the Killer is pretty much sculpted. Now it's time for the hair. Admittedly, this will get a rework later on, but initially I'm considering taking the approach of stylized sculpted on the hair. It's sort of like how Lego hair looks, but ideally with more realism. As a base, we're adding a sphere tinted black and pulling its shapes to wrap around Jeff's head, with the exception of parts where the hair hangs low to the shoulders. We can use a snake hook brush here that's similar to a normal grabbing and moving brush, except it also adds a little more geometry when it does it, so we don't run out of faces to work with as quickly. We'll come back to define the actual strands later, but I'm going to go back to the head for now to do some even further adjustment. Initially just proportioning stuff and trying to get it to look better and closer to the OG image, but as we get a better shape we can take a moment to do some detailing. Human mouths generally have a bit of an overlapping fold at the corners of their mouth where the fat pads from your cheeks overlap the muscles in the edge of your mouth, and it becomes more prevalent the wider you smile as it pulls farther into the cheeks. I later clocked that this probably wouldn't be entirely lore accurate for Jeff, considering his mouth is actually cut open, but I'm mostly going off the image here, which doesn't really have any scarring or anything, so I'm just going to consider myself safe for now. And in the same way as those folds, I'm going to add some mass onto the corners of the mouth, slightly folding over the corners. Now it's time for the hoodie! Rather than creating a new object and pulling it around to fit the model, we're just going to draw a mask from the neck down, which is this black painting you're seeing on screen, and create a new object from that, which I can then pull out the back of to create the hood that Jeff has pulled down, using the mask to only edit the collar area of the hoodie, so the hoodie can fold over the back without pulling the whole thing down with it. In the same vein, we're using a brush that effectively inflates the surface and gives it a bit of a thickness and roundness around the collar area so that the sides of the hood can wrap around to the front. Hoodies aren't crazy complex, so all it needs is some smoothing to clean it up, and just like Slenderman's suit from earlier, we're drawing in some lines to act as the wrinkles, plus some holes in the front of the collar for the strings that you'd use to tighten the hood. The strings themselves will do after the fact, trust. Remember the hair? We're so back! And we're gonna add a bunch of lines that flow down into the shape of the hairline to give the appearance of the hair. Again, this gets reworked later, but at least you get the concept. It's the last touch, and now we just need to retopologize it. However, unlike Slender, Jeff has a face. Not a nose, mind you, but it's a step closer. That means that instead of relying on shrink wrap modifiers here, we're going to actually have to do it all manually. So that's what we'll do, drawing in the edges around the floor of the eyes and mouth and enveloping it all around the head and shoulders to create an optimized version of our Jeff sculpt. The same goes for the hoodie, all manual. It's once I get to the hair that I clocked two things. 1. Retopologizing something like this hair is going to be incredibly tedious, like prohibitively tedious, at least if I were to fit the shapes perfectly. 2, this sucks. It's not the worst, but it's like not the most high effort hair model in the world. So, I came up with a new idea. I was still gonna retopologize the hair, but not super closely. We're just gonna get the basic shape, and that'll be the base of the hair. And what we're gonna do is use a technique known as hair cards. This gets used in a lot of video games, and the idea is that you have a hair texture that consists of a lock of strands. And then you assign that texture to a flat plane, i.e. a card, and use that around the head. With enough cards and a good enough placement, it should look like hair. Now, I don't have any hair textures lying around, and I can't in good faith just go steal one from a model rip, so I'm gonna look at some hair card textures and try to recreate it to the best of my ability. Sometimes this process uses more than one hair texture for more naturally believable looks, but we're just gonna go with the one for now. We can place these over the top of the head base we just did and try our best to align it to Jeff's theoretical hairline without having too many intersecting cards. I also have a shrink wrap modifier assigned to this, which only affects the hair cards at their roots, while the rest of it is just a little more free-flowing. It's not perfect, but I was pleasantly surprised with the result. Jeff has hair. Now we can UV map this. Same as before, it's all marking seams and figuring out what'll work so we can prepare Jeff for the texturing to come. There's not much variation in texturing Jeff compared to the texturing for Slenderman, and we're just drawing in the colors as per the original reference image, painting on those dark circles around the eyes and those big crimson lips. The gums are pink, and the teeth have a slightly yellow texture that's blended to have more yellowing at the roots of the teeth, and it's here that I noticed the way the baking process imprinted the sculpt onto the low polygon model here makes the teeth a little glitchy in between. To fix that, we can just draw in some lines in those edges with a height layer going inwards to simulate the depth better. Next up, we're creating layers for each part of the model respectively. Just like the Slender model, we actually receive the painted colors we did while sculpting as textures, but again we're going to create our own layers to replace them, so we can just have a bit more control. For the hoodie, we're just doing what we did for Slenderman's suit again, and creating a texture that uses the fabric pattern as its mask, with the layer itself affecting the height and the color to a lesser extent to create the appearance that the hoodie is in fact made of some kind of fabric. It's subtle in the sculpt and especially in the textures, but we'll place some metal rings around the holes on the hoodie where the strings would be with a black hole in the middle. That way it's more visibly a pair of string holes on the collar and not just a weird dent. The baking of this sculpt into the model's textures, just like the teeth, also has left a bit of glitchiness around the lower neck and shoulder areas of Jeff's body. As a result, we'll draw in some dark shadowing in that area, both to cover it up, but also to make it look more like Jeff's really in that hoodie, you know? Speaking of the bake textures, same as last time, we can also use procedural wear and dirt here to give the surface some imperfections. Some dirt on the face, a little more on the clothes, and also a subtly noisy texture on the surface of the skin to emulate something akin to pores or the pockiness of his burnt skin. Either way, Jeff's textures are done, and all that's left is to create those hoodie strings. Just two mirrored cylinders stretched down with their UV maps aligned over the broad surface of the hoodie to match, and black for the aglets at the end. That's Jeff done, and now we can put his model to rest. Or to sleep. Like, go to sleep, like his catchphrase. Yeah, it works.
Acceptable result.
That's 2 down, 1 to go. I think we're getting the hang of this. Should only need 1 more to open up. Door, what will it be?
Turn to page 64.
Alright, let's see here. The Russian Sleep Experiment. A story in which 5 people are put into a test chamber and dosed with a powerful stimulant that prevents sleep. Said tests take place in a Soviet-era testing lab, and said stimulants are given by pumping the room with gas. Suffice to say, things don't go well when the stimulants are cut off, and the test subjects fight to stay awake by ripping off skin and just going absolutely berserk. Accompanied with the story was this absolutely harrowing image, presumably meant to be one of the subjects given the context. If it gives you the heebie-jeebies, not to worry. It's not real, if you didn't figure that out already, but it's not a Photoshop job either. Well, unless you count the black and white color scheme. It's actually a life-size Halloween decoration called Spasm. Pretty gnarly. It's nowhere near as intimidating when you look at the real thing though. The lighting and desaturation do wonders for this thing's aura. The story itself was quite popular in its 2010 release, and its writer was a user by the name of Orange Soda. Looking at the picture itself, it looks to be an emaciated person hunched on a chair and a big toothy grin visible past their tight skin and a very defined bony face. While the Spasm decoration is literally what this is a picture of, I'm gonna go ahead and only use it for reference, since it's clear the picture used for the creepypasta was intended with some visual trickery in mind. The body is angled so you can't quite tell they're wearing a straight jacket, the muzzle on the side isn't really that visible, and because of the lighting and coloration you can't really tell that there's a head wrap on there. It reads more like weathered skin. So, while it may raise some eyebrows, I'm adapting this as I see it in the picture, rather than the Spasm itself. And once again, we start with our sculpting base and work from there. I'm starting off on the torso, since it's going to be the area with the most normal anatomy, and I can just use reference to draw in the muscles in that area. This is again stuff like the traps, pecs, and sternocleidomastoid. Just love saying it. The creature in the image has a pretty defined bone structure, so we'll need to make that reflect in the model. We'll draw in some lines to define the jawline and dig in a mouth just above it. That way we can show off all those big gnarly teeth. I'll get to modeling in a minute, but for now we're gonna get the rest of the forms of the head in. That means creating some eye sockets and brow lines and drawing in those cheekbones. And guess what? We finally have a character with a nose! I'm adding a rough one on the front that's more of a bump at this point, and throwing in 2 spheres for eyeballs. This is just a rough go over for everything, so I'm not trying to get it to match perfectly just yet. I'm just trying to get a head. Now we can get those teeth in, and it's essentially the same process as the one we did for Jeff. We make a C shape for the gums and a bunch of smaller, longer shapes for the teeth. Except this time, rather than more humanoid teeth, the subject for this Russian sleep experiment has much more monstrous ones, appearing longer and sharper. Once we've got that in our scene, we can put them in place, and we can move on to adjusting some more shapes. The subject in the photo has a pretty hunched over look, and as a result we'll need to make the torso reflect that. That means pulling up the shoulders and pulling the whole torso back a bit so that the neck can be more slouched forward. Now I can start getting into more of the nitty gritty. The subject has a pretty bulbous head. I think that's on account of the head wrap, but since we're treating this all as skin, I'll just adjust that slightly on the head, and then go on to the face. We're defining the nose a bit here, giving some nostrils and adding mass to the front of the nose, moving on up to the brow where we can draw in the muscles that come up from the brow into the forehead and defining the skull structure into the sides of the head. The eyes will take a bit to adjust on account of their sort of dead-eyed vacant stare, but we can at least get those eyelids in to better illustrate the shape and give the area around it a rounder and more organic appearance. The front of the forehead on the original reference is actually pretty sloped back, so we're gonna pull back on those shapes a bit since the initial build-up is a bit intense and gives it a bit too much of an angry caveman look. Going around some other contours of the face, we're adding in some lines to pinch in the edges of the lips a bit and make the laugh lines under the cheekbones a little clearer. It's gonna take a bit to get the nose right, but the Russian sleep experiment seems to have a pretty prominent nose bridge, sloping outwards rather than inwards with a slight downward turn. The experiment also has a bit of a longer face than what we've been working with, so some stretching is in order, but if we just stretch and grab everything with a move brush and pull it up, it'll stretch everything with it and look pretty sloppy. So we're placing a mask over the bottom half of the head instead, just below the nose, and pulling it up that way, just like we did with Jeff earlier if you remember. With a better idea of the head shape, we'll make some quick adjustments before getting back into the details. This time, around the mouth. Like sculpting in some of the padding around the jaw and the bottom lip, plus those folding corners on the mouth that I mentioned earlier when we were working on Jeff. Some more touch-ups on the side profile and we'll smooth over everything. We're not too far into finer details yet, so we can afford to do this without losing much, and we'll adjust the shapes of the mouth and nose a little bit more. Now we can add a few details back in, sculpting around the brow and eyelids and defining the cheek wrinkling just a bit more, as well as defining the edges between the eye sockets and eyelids, since the original character has a pretty thin distance between the brow and eyelids, which is something that varies between people. Now we're going on to some surface detail. The subject of the sleep experiment has pretty rough looking skin, no doubt as a result of being starved and going feral with his fellow test subjects. So, it's time to sculpt in those gnarly wrinkles and bumps. We'll change our sculpting brush up a little, still using the same one we've been using to add mass, but this time we're changing the alpha. The alpha is essentially the shape of our brush, and by default it's a square shape, which lets us define pretty hard shapes and get the forms in. But now that we're moving on to the finer organic details, we'll use a circular alpha, which should have a smoother and more natural result when we sculpt. We're going over the model, creating the tautness of the skin by drawing the lines that give the illusion of skin being pulled back over the face, and adding in smaller folds and wrinkles under places that line the laugh lines, eyelids, and jaw area. A lot of these wrinkles are also going along the grain of the face muscles, that way it looks more natural rather than looking like we just drew a bunch of lines haphazardly over this thing. We'll also throw in a line on the back to better define the traps and draw some mass in between so the line isn't too extreme. From there, we can make some adjustments to the head shape just to make sure it looks how we want, and then make a final pass on the nose to make sure it really lines up with the reference. I'm also painting in the pupils and stuff, but that's not really here or there. Again, it's just so I can get an idea of where we're going. Now we can work on retopology. The teeth are already good to go since we created a base for them earlier that's pre-optimized, and I can just make some new lower resolution spheres for the eyeballs, so it's all a matter of getting the sculpt retopologized. There's no tips or tricks here, this is a full-on face, and a full-on face deserves a full-on retopology. I still have the modifiers I like to use for this, a mirror modifier, a subdivision modifier, and a shrink wrap modifier. But we're going over all of it manually, marking out edges around crucial areas like the eyes, nose, and mouth, and then connecting their faces and working outwards to the rest of the head. There's some guides on the way you should align your topology on a human face, but for the most part what you see is a general idea of how it should be laid out, with some variation on the cleanliness of the process. We're not aiming for a model built for animation as much as being for display, so the amount of care we need to put into this is less of a strong point. That being said, I don't think it's half bad. That's a Russian sleep experiment if I've ever seen one. And once again, there's not many places to hide our seams for the UV unwrapping. So, we're placing them on the sides of the head, the edges of the inside of the mouth, and around the neck leading out into the sides of the shoulders. That way, we should have a pretty even distribution of UV islands on our texture space, and ideally that means an even distribution of texture quality across the board. For the textures, I'm aiming for a relatively pale appearance here to try and emulate the grey palette of the original picture, but I am throwing in a splash of colour in so it can look a little bit more alive, and I'm actually using the painting on the original Spasm prop as reference for that. Initial steps are to add the base colours, a dark crimson for gums and a greyish colour for the teeth, with some yellowing closer to the roots. The eyes use a dark base with white faded into the middle. That way it looks like the eyelids are shadowing in the edges of the eyes, and we're also drawing in some pretty huge pupils. It's not really visible in the picture, but it felt right to throw in some barely visible irises, and also some dark veins around the edges of the eyeballs to really give off that crazed and horribly sleep-deprived look. We'll also give the gums a little height detail around the edges of the teeth to look like they're really rooted in there, as well as some surface brushing on the teeth with some height layered in. That way those pearly whites aren't looking too perfect. We'll also make the insides of the mouth black and blend it in a bit so the inside can be obscured in shadows. We can't really see much of the mouth past the teeth, so there's no point getting too detailed with it. Hey, do you remember that we get special textures from baking the high detail model into the lower detail model's textures? Same principle here, and we're using some of those textures to define the details in the face better by adding in an ambient occlusion texture that creates subtle shadowing, and a curvature texture that exaggerates the fold and angles of our experiment. Now it's time for actual skin coloration. Since this guy's meant to be a super pale, I'm using a slightly grayed color as the base and then painting over it with a bunch of colors. The way colors on the face are distributed are generally sanctioned, at least in the context of texturing, by the distribution of blood, fat, and hair, represented by red, yellow, and blue respectively. Obviously that isn't the one-all be-all rule for it, but it's the way I like to go about it, and there's some pretty useful references out there on how to lay it all out. Rather than using straight red for the blood though, I want it to look more sickly, so instead of a smooth blush over those areas, I'm using a more scattered dirt brush with a closer color to purple or maroon, which gives off more of the look that a lot of these blood vessels are either burst or damaged, or is otherwise just not in great condition. Now, suffice to say, this guy isn't very fatty, so a lot of the yellowing is going along places that are generally more padded up, like the cheeks, brow, chin, and nose, although the nose is less for fat and more for cartilage. But since blood vessels are pretty crowded there, it's also going to be overtaken by a lot of the red for the most part. The bluer parts I'm going to put less focus on, if not outright ignore it, on account of the fact that this thing is super duper bold. But usually you'd see it on the tops of the head and the jaw area respectively if you're curious. We're going to readjust our curvature texture a bit. Rather than just using the color, we're incorporating a bit of the height layer to it, which should even further define those wrinkles and make it just look a bit more extreme. I'm sure that's a bit of a no-no in texturing since it's kind of just doubling up on the detail that's already there, but I'm just doing what I think looks right. This results in a little bit of artifacting on the teeth, but since we don't need the curvature as much on those teeth, we can just erase it out in those areas. We'll add a bit more red into the textures in places that really have a lot of blood vessels packed in, since the previous blood colors we did were more broad strokes. This time we're using a slightly redder color over these higher density areas like the lips, nose, and eyelids. I also noticed that the original spasm prop has some vomit or froth of some kind coming out of the mouth, and at a closer glance it's visible on the Russian sleep experiment photo too. So we're gonna add that in. Since I'm painting this right onto the face, I can't use any transparency for this since it'll just fade right through the head. So we're gonna have to make it convincing using some height layering and a blur filter to make it look less intense. The bubbling on its surface also has its own height layer and it's a bit wider to illustrate the fact that it's coming off the surface of the face a bit more, and we'll just experiment with the colors and shininess until we get something that looks right. I thought it looked a little odd to have that froth there without any other stains, so I also created a separate layer with just shininess so I can draw in around that area to give the appearance of saliva stains around the mouth. It's at this point that I decided to get rid of the grayed irises entirely in favor of big black pupils, which is more true to the original image, and despite it probably being cheating, I also added some pinprick white dots in the center to reflect the shininess of the eyes in the original image, that feel like they're directing the eyes right to you. For a final touch on the skin, we're adding in those procedural dirt textures again. This just helps the surface have more of an organic wear and create some more imperfections without having to go over all of it manually. And once again, this process is just using the baked textures we got from applying the sculpt details to this model. And that closes out the textures and the model itself. Gaze upon the emaciated form of the Russian sleep experiment. Let's see how we did.
Acceptable result. The price has been paid.
Yes! Finally!
Go to sleep. Go to Russian sleep.
Whoa! Ugh. After all this time, I've waited so long. I've brought the essence of 3 creepypasta figures into existence, into the 3rd dimension. And now that I've paid the price, I can finally get what I've been searching for. A new entity to bring to power. The newest in the line of eldritch horrors. My own creepypasta villain! Behold! Enib! Hey, it's Hib, Enib. We can work on that one. Go on, get out of here. Whew, looks like that's done. Hey, thanks for coming along. I wanted to get something done for the Halloween season, and I'm pretty happy. November! I grew up reading creepypastas as they got popular, and it's fun to get some creative expression out of them. Hopefully you enjoyed it too, and if you liked it enough to support the video, engagement like commenting or liking the video helps push it out to the algorithm. And if you want to be there for the next big thing, subscribing's probably the best way to keep tabs on me. I'll be out with another video this month, so keep an eye out. And yeah, I mean this month. I missed October by a skid, but hopefully you'll forgive me. With that out of the way, I'll see you for whatever we end up doing next. Thanks again, everyone.